Joining us on the line to discuss it is Romina Boccia. She's director of the Grover M. Herman Center for the Federal Budget, and she's a leading fiscal and economic expert at the Heritage Foundation. Romina, thanks so much for joining the Ben Shapiro Show.
Thanks for having me, Ben. It's my pleasure.
So I want to go through a couple of the myths that seem to be put out there by the media, especially on tax day. Myth number one, if you could debunk it a little bit, is the idea that the rich in America are not paying their fair share. What do you make of this line that is now being repeated by every progressive leftist and members of the media, but I repeat myself?
You know, we should ask people, what do they think is the fair share? And what you'll find is that most people think it's much lower than the actual tax share that the wealthiest Americans pay, because the top 10% of income earners actually pay more than 70% of the federal income tax burden. And more than half of Americans now have faced no federal income tax burden at all. They do pay state and local taxes, property taxes, and payroll taxes, but when it comes to federal income taxes, they face no burden. And there is even fewer people now who are sharing in the tax burden after the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which exempted even more Americans due to the doubling of the standard deduction. So we really have a highly progressive tax code here in the United States, much more progressive than in Europe, where the middle class really bears the largest share, especially with the consumption taxes in place there.
Well, Romina, when we look at the tax structure in the United States, and then we see the media reporting over and over again that the rich are not paying their fair share, it does obviously seem to be a matter of media bias. I'm confused as to what they actually think the statistics are. Do you think that this comes from ignorance, or do you think this actually comes from people knowing the facts and not caring about the facts?
I think it comes from knowing the facts and not caring about the facts, because I see a lot of miscommunication of actual facts that you could easily look up if you were a reporter that had any integrity at all. The reporting on how much people pay in taxes is one example. Another blatant example is the gender wage gap, where even President Obama kept touting this false statistic after his own Department of Labor debunked it. So I think this is a conveniently telling stories to make people angry, to play into their fears, and to play into envy and greed to motivate people to vote and support for a certain party and certain politicians, and has nothing to do with reality at all. And we're seeing this with these tax cuts, where the myth continues to spread that this was just a tax cut for the rich, when the exact opposite is the case.
Well, that's certainly the case. I mean, I live in California, and I pay in the top tax bracket, and that means that I'm actually paying a lot more than I did last year, specifically because I can no longer take my tax at the state level and use it as a deduction against my federal taxes. So I'm paying the top tax rate in California. And federally, this has happened to a lot of people who are high earners in states like California and New York, and yet the media continue to suggest that it was tax cuts for the wealthy, many of whom are paying higher taxes as a result of the Trump tax cuts.
That's absolutely right. In fact, 9 out of 10 Americans got a tax cut from the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, and that 10% of Americans that are paying higher taxes after the tax law, those are exactly the people you're mentioning, folks living in New York, Maryland, which is where I'm living, California. And a lot of states are seeing those wealthier individuals fleeing those high tax states now, which I think is a good thing, because we need more competition also on the state level. And for too long, states like New York and California that like to spend a lot of money were able to get away with it by basically getting other taxpayers in more frugal states like Texas and Alabama to subsidize high state spending in California and New York. I'm glad that there's a cap now on that state and local tax deduction, and we really should eliminate it altogether, because it makes no sense for taxpayers in Texas to fund high spending in New York.
We're speaking with Romina Boccia. She's a leading fiscal and economic expert at the Heritage Foundation. So, Romina, one of the contentions that I've heard made by people like Bernie Sanders is that, sure, the rich people are paying a lot of money, but they're also making a lot of money. And they point to the fact that the top 1%, their income has been increasing at a faster rate than the bottom 99%. That's the sort of language they use. What's the flaw in that thinking?
There is a lot of flaws. So first of all, let's look at how have wage earners fared just since 2017. They've actually seen a wage increase of $2,200, with the largest gains accruing to the lowest income earners, particularly hourly wage earners. And why is that? Because our economy is so strong that employers have to entice people to come work for them, and to do so they have to pay higher wages. That's why having a strong economy is so important. Moreover, in terms of inequality, I think that focus on that is completely wrong, because what should matter is how are the most vulnerable, lowest income people faring in our society. are we do we live in a society where there's opportunity for everyone to work hard and to realize their version of the American dream? That's what we should measure. And many people who are in the highest earning quintiles, they fall out of those quintiles. You see people rising up because they work hard, they innovate, they take risks, and they build things that make our lives better. And they should be rewarded for that. But if they make mistakes and make bad decisions and squander their money and don't invest it well, they will fall out of that high income tax bracket again. So it's not that people are at the top and they just stay there. It's something that comes as a result of hard work, of making innovations, and then it's also something you can't hold on to unless you continue to work hard at that. And we need to make sure our society continues to reward risk-taking and innovation, and to the extent that we have barriers in the place of people to be entrepreneurial and to reach those highest levels of the income scale, those are the things we need to remove so that everyone can have a chance at the American dream.
Now, statistically speaking, have we seen a reduction in income mobility among people in the lower quintiles? Because we keep hearing that over the last 30, 35 years, that there's been a reduction in both income growth and also in income mobility among people in the lower quintiles. I've seen various statistics on this, some of them conflicting. How do you answer that question?
I think that we do have a problem, and it arises from the fact that we don't have school choice, that we have individuals who are trapped in poor counties with low property values, and they're trapped in poor schools, and they're not able to get out of those situations. And I think that is a problem that we can address, that we can tackle, and that would create so much more opportunity without having to create new government programs. Just giving parents the choice and letting them use their tax dollars through education savings accounts with support from the state and local government to send their kids to schools that actually will educate them for the jobs of today and the future, that would make a huge difference.
So what do we actually do to clear up the national debt? Because this is one of the other questions, is that our tax rates are extraordinarily progressive, much more progressive than other European countries. People think that when we say that, what we mean is that they are higher on the rich than other European countries. But that's not what we mean. What we mean is that the highest tax bracket starts at like 60 grand in places like Denmark, whereas the highest tax bracket in the United States may not start until you hit $400,000. That's why we are more progressive than other nations in terms of how we tax. But the reason that other nations are not progressive in terms of how they tax is because they are paying for their vast social welfare state, and we are simply not. So how exactly are we supposed to do that other than through either massive cuts or through significantly increased taxation?
Yes, that's exactly what we're looking at, is much higher taxes in the future and less opportunity, frankly, because what the debt also does, this high and rising debt, it drags down growth. And that is research that's very robust across industrialized countries. Over 800 years of history, we know that this high debt drags down growth. And while we may not experience it as directly today, over the long run, it depresses wages and economic growth. And already the level of debt per person in the United States is $70,000. And it's projected to rise well to over $100,000 just over the next 10 years. So those are huge debt burdens that the United States government is taking on the backs of the American people. I mean, we are the credit on which they borrow. It's our labor, our ability to produce and pay taxes. And the question is, when will those taxes hit? And just how much will the federal government try to get away with it? And I'm particularly concerned about the recent conversation that says, don't worry about the debt, even though it's already larger than our entire economy and growing at a faster rate. Just continue to spend and borrow and just print the money as if inflation was something that we wouldn't need to worry about. And I worry this country is acting like the unsinkable ship, like the Titanic, heading straight for the iceberg until it's too late. We need to change course and steer the fiscal ship in a sustainable direction, and that's why at Heritage we produced a blueprint for balance that shows Congress how they can balance the budget by targeting benefits towards the most vulnerable and cutting those programs that are crony and that represent subsidies that distort the market, as well as things that should be handled on a state and local level.
Well, Romina Boccia, Thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate your time. She's a leading fiscal and economic expert at the Heritage Foundation and director of the Grover M. Herman Center for the Federal Budget. Romina, appreciate your time. Thanks for clearing up some of the myths and misconceptions on tax day.